can speak for a bit and exchange. So real quick, let's just test to see if the feature to raise your hand is working. If you can hear me, go ahead and raise your hand. Again, it's *9 if you're on the phone, and if you are joining us on your computer, there should be a button at the bottom of the participants bar on your right-hand side. Cool. I see lots of hands. Great, it's good to see all of you on the call tonight. It looks like we have about 36 people. We're really excited to have you join us tonight to talk a bit about the Security and Exchange Commission's Edgar Database website, which is a really useful tool for doing corporate research. So to review some of our goals for this evening, we are hoping that everyone leaves the call tonight understanding what corporate research is and how it can strengthen and inform grassroots organizing efforts. We would love for all of you to become familiar with how to navigate the Securities and Exchange Commission's Edgar Database, as I said earlier. So we'll be reviewing in depth about 3 different forms to look out for on the SEC website that can provide extensive information about key executives and directors of corporations. And lastly, we'd love for everyone to learn about a couple of ongoing projects that we're doing so that you can plug in and use some of your new Edgar skills on the work that we're doing, but also the ongoing organizing work that's happening in your own communities. So next we'll review the agenda. We're doing the welcome now. We'll review for a bit about why we should do corporate research, what corporate research is, what we look for when doing corporate research, and we'll review a case study. And we'll be using Geo Group as a case study throughout the entire call this evening. Then we'll dig deep, looking at some forms on the SEC Edgar database, and we'll hop on there and show you how to navigate the database. We'll share 2 research guides that are super useful for conducting power research. They provide step-by-step guides on where to look and how to begin doing corporate research. Then we'll tell you about some of the ongoing projects that LittleSis has that you can plug into, and share a bit about what's next and how we can move forward collectively towards action. Cool. So for those of you who don't know, LittleSis is a research group, a watchdog research group, and we run a database of information on powerful people and organizations. It's a wiki-style website, so all of the information is free and crowdsourced. And the purpose of our LittleSis is to really connect and reveal the connections between powerful people, corporations, and also public officials. So we also, go by the opposite of Big Brother and have been referred to as an involuntary Facebook of the 1%. For those of you who are unfamiliar with LittleSis, it's free, so you're able to hop on the website and create a profile and begin using today. So Map the Power is a project of LittleSis that was launched this spring. It's a project to train and support activists and organizers who are interested in carrying out power research. So we aim to build a network of activist researchers who are capable of doing strategic, investigative research that strengthens organizing and also creative resistance to challenge the most powerful individuals, corporations, and organizations in our society. So this call is a part of our efforts to kind of strengthen some movement infrastructure and begin to develop this network. So why do corporate research? So corporations are powerful, right? They have an undue amount of influence at the local, state, and federal level, and both shape and maintain their power by exploiting the most marginalized in our society. So corporate research really helps us to understand what corporations want and how they plan to get it. It allows us to identify the different business, political, social, and personal relationships that corporations and their leadership have to progress their agenda. And so corporate research allows us to understand the content of their agenda, to identify potential allies in our struggle, right? Because when we examine and really investigate these powerful corporations, it's very, actually a small group of people who sit on the boards of Fortune 500 companies, who run Fortune 500 companies that are progressing corporate interests rather than the interests of the people. So this corporate research also allows us to identify potential allies and where we have the power to really disrupt through organizing. Now Molly is going to give us a few examples of how corporate research has been used in conjunction with grassroots organizing.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Christian. So we're going to spend most of our time in tonight's 1 hour kind of looking at the Securities and Exchange Commission's Edgar Database and really going through specific filings and showing you all how to find some of this information. But just as a little bit of framing and to kind of get us thinking about how does this kind of research translate into organizing strategy and translate into grassroots organizing, direct action, creative resistance, like Christiane mentioned, and really pushing back on corporate power in this country. I wanted to give a few examples of kind of research and organizing working together. So you'll see a couple of little pictures on the slide here. One of them is at a protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline out of a Wells Fargo bank branch. So I'm sure folks saw in the past year, there's been a lot of pressuring of the banks that are involved in financing the Dakota Access Pipeline to pull the financing for the pipeline. And in order to figure out who was financing the project and what made good targets, people had to do some corporate research, in part using the Edgar Database that we'll show tonight, and going through filings that show the financing relationships between Energy Transfer Partners, the company that's building the pipeline, and various banks. So that's one example of kind of going up the corporate ladder to identify investors that could be pressured to get a company to do something. Another quick example from New York City is New York City's pension fund just became one of the first ones, I think the first one in the country, to pull its money out of private prisons and immigrant detention center corporations that operate immigrant detention centers. Again, in order to make that happen and realize that that was a strategic thing that could be pushed for, people had to do a little bit of corporate research into if the pension fund was invested in private prisons, which pension funds are invested, and now that could be something that's taken to different places and cities and states. Another example real quick from some of our work to lift up is a couple of years ago in 2012, there was a big fracking study from the University of Texas that came out that was really highly promoted by the fracking industry, by the oil and gas industry, saying that there had never been any groundwater contamination from fracking. And it was, really lifted up in a lot of newspapers. And then using some corporate research and using the Edgar database, it was actually identified that the main lead scientist on the study sat on the board of an oil and gas company. And he had actually made like 4 times his salary as a university as a board member of that company, around $400,000, and had amassed over a $1.6 million stake in the company. And so it kind of, the research exposed that conflict of interest. He eventually had to step down. There was a big push to delegitimize that study at a moment when fracking was really in the news as something that was new and the industry was trying to push us safe. So that's another example of kind of identifying conflicts of interest. And then the last one I wanted to share was some organizing happening in California, where community groups there are organizing tenants who live in apartments and houses that are owned by a company called Colony Starwood, that's headed by this guy, Tom Barrack, who's a huge Trump donor, a billionaire in Southern California, very politically and corporate influential. And some corporate research can help us there because I'll show folks later, but by looking into filings of a corporation or one that owns land, you can see what properties they own. In the case of this company, Colony Starwood, you can see what the different cities they own rental units are in and how many rental units they own, what the average rent is. So it can really help you if you're thinking about kind of a corporate campaign or a national campaign, identify where are the different places where you want to have people organizing to push back on a company. So I know that's a lot, but those are just, you know, a few examples to get people thinking. And we really want to encourage folks to, as we're showing how to do this research and find this information, be thinking about the local organizing context where you live, or if you're involved with a particular organization or campaign, and kind of what questions, research questions you would want to investigate and how you could use some similar information to what we're showing you all kind of in your local context. And sometimes that's really obvious and it's like, oh, we found this conflict of interest, we should put that into the media, or oh, like we see that there's a priority that a company has around getting public money for a particular project, so we should try to intervene in that process. And sometimes it's more generally just get so I think this graphic should be familiar to folks who have been on our previous calls, but this is a little bit of a corporate web that we often use to show the different types of information that we're often interested in looking at. Like if we're approaching a company that we know there's some kind of campaign, whether it's a worker organizing campaign or some campaign to stop a pipeline that an oil and gas industry company is building, or to push back on a corporate developer, here's some of the key information we want to know going in. And so some of that here is the leadership of the company. So who is key management? Who's the CEO? Who's the chief financial officer? Who are the people that are really making the daily decisions in the company and that wield a lot of power and are also kind of public facing and therefore vulnerable in some way? We want to understand also who's on the board of directors of the company. And again, those are key decision makers and that often, as Christiane was saying, kind of sit on other corporations, have very influential political, business, and personal networks. So we want to get a sense of that. We want to understand who their investors are, who owns their stock, who owns large amounts of stock in a company. Because again, that can be another way to pressure the company. We want to understand who their creditors are. Companies are obviously very dependent on their creditors for money and to run their operations. We want to understand who those institutions are. Subsidiaries, like what other smaller companies does the company we're interested in own, or are they themselves a subsidiary of a larger company? And sometimes that can be hard to find, but we're going to show folks a little trick on that tonight. And oftentimes, corporations are very complex and have lots of subsidiaries, so we want to understand that. We also want to understand campaign contributions and political allies. Who have they given money to? What politicians are they known to be particularly close to? Revolving door relationships between their employees and lobbyists and government. Philanthropy, we want to understand, are they connected to any charities? Do they have a foundation? Where are they giving money to? Lobbyists, do they have any lobbyists on the payroll? And if so, what are they lobbying for? Again, so we can kind of understand that corporate agenda. And then the last thing we have up here is trade associations. So understanding what kinds of trade groups is this company part of, because oftentimes it's not a particular company that's going to be promoting a policy or saying like, we're against raising the minimum wage or we're for massive deregulation. Sometimes that's the case, but oftentimes not. They'll set up trade organizations that kind of carry the water for them and carry that message. But we want to be able to trace it back to the real corporate culprit. So for tonight, we're going to show you folks a little bit about how to do corporate research using the Geo Group as our example. And so for folks who don't know, Geo Group has been in the news a lot recently, and I know we have some folks here who work on prison and policing abolition issues, so I'm sure a lot of y'all know, but for folks who don't, the Geo Group is a private prison company. It was founded in 1984. It used to be called Wackenhut Corrections. And together with CoreCivic, which used to be called Corrections Corporation of America, they're the two largest and are really the primary private prison operators in the country. And they operate a whole host of different things, including prisons, immigrant detention centers. So they've been one of the companies that have been in the news for their stock kind of going through the roof since Trump was elected, because there's anticipation that there's going to need to be more facilities built to detain undocumented folks. And they're also kind of increasingly involved in different issues of and sectors of re-entry, so like electronic monitoring and surveillance of people after they're released from prison. We'll talk about that a little bit. And they've also been in the news a lot because they gave a significant amount of money to the Trump fundraising super PAC. They gave about $125,000. And their shares are just at an all-time high right now. So we're going to use them as an example, and folks can be thinking about, for different kind of companies, how the research might look a little different. But really, kind of when we're using the SEC Edgar database, our goal is going to be to understand more about like how Geo Group is thinking about their business and their expansion. And continuing to grow profits, because we know that's what their number one concern is. And so if we're working towards a world in which there aren't any private prisons, how can we use the information that they are putting out there to understand kind of their priorities and figure out how we can push back against that? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen in a sec. But real quick, so the thing we're going to show tonight, like I've said a bunch of times, is the Securities and Exchange Commission's Edgar database. And basically, since the 1930s, there's been, increasing, in some ways, regulation of corporations to have to disclose particular information to their investors and also to the public as well. So, the primary regulatory agency that does that is called the Securities and Exchange Commission, and they oversee a public free database called Edgar, which stands for the very easy to remember Electronic Data Gathering, Analysis, and Retrieval database. And you can use that database to access all different types of filings that a company has to make public to its investors, but then also it's often used by activists, by unions, by other kind of movement groups to understand what's going on with the company. And so tonight we're going to go over 3 different kinds of filings that a company has to put out. One is a proxy statement. We'll talk more about what that means in a sec. And the technical name for that is DEF 14A. One is an annual report, which is kind of the more technical version of the kind of glossy annual reports that companies often put out, like for their investors, that will just have like kind of, fancy pie charts and glossy pictures, but this is the more technical version. And then we're going to talk about an 8K, which is a notification of a current event, kind of like a press release for the Securities and Exchange Commission. Anytime anything major happens in a company, they have to release this thing called the 8K. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a sec and go on over to the internet so you all can follow along with me to get to the Edgar database. Cool. So you should just be able to see Google, our favorite research tool. So the first thing I'm going to do is just Google SEC Edgar. And that's going to take us to this sec.gov company search page. This is the search engine for Edgar. And there's a couple of different ways you can start a search. So one is you can type in the company name here where it says company name. The other is this fast search. So you can find the stock symbol for a company and type that in here. That's the way that, if you can, I generally prefer to do, because if I put in Geo here, it might come up with a whole host of things like, you know, a company that has geographic in the name, or a bunch of different smaller companies that have the phrase Geo in it. But every company just has one particular and unique stock symbol. So we know that if we use that, we'll get the right result. So to figure out Geo Group, I'm going to Google Geo Group stock symbol. And, you know, for any company that's publicly traded, Google will bring up this little box here. So very conveniently for Geo Group, it's just Geo. So I'm going to go back to Edgar and search Geo. And this is going to take us to this page here that is basically a little search page of all the different filings that Geo Group has filed with the SEC going back like 30 years. And the first one that I often look at to kind of get a basic overview of a company and kind of understanding their operations, what's important to them, where they're coming from, starting to identify opportunities for organizing, is the 10K. So that's the annual report. And you could scroll through here, these little filing sections, to see the most recent 10K down here. The date is right here from February of this year. As a little faster way, you can also, in this filing type in 10K and hit enter, and it'll bring up, you know, all the 10Ks going back to 1997 in this case. So I want to see this year's 10K, so I'm going to click this little documents button, and then it's going to bring me up to yet another screen. The main form will always be at the top here, Form 10K. And then there's some additional exhibits, basically like little add-ons. We'll look at some of those later. Some pictures, some various other stuff. But in this case, we're going to look at the 10K first. So I'm going to click here under this document column. And it's going to bring me to something that looks like this, which doesn't look particularly fun to read, but really will give us a lot of information. And a lot of the language in a 10K is going to be kind of like boilerplate language that every 10K will have. But if you know the right places to look, you can dig up some interesting stuff. So a couple of things to highlight for folks. One is, like, they'll always have the corporate address of the company, which, you know, oftentimes you can find through Google, but that's kind of a useful thing to know if you're planning an action at the headquarters, if you want to do a letter writing campaign, anything that you want to know their corporate address. They'll have the principal executive office's address right here at the top. And then this tends to be a lot of boilerplate language, and then it's going to take you down to a table of contents. And the table of contents is definitely super useful because, you know, it's a almost 200-page document, so that's really going to help you navigate it. Just using Control F and searching for keywords is another thing that's really useful. So, like, you know, I live in Philadelphia, so if I was you know, trying to understand what kind of operations Geo Group has in Philly, or if they have offices here, I'd probably just do a Control F for Philadelphia just to see where they're talking about Philly. But there are a bunch of different things in this table of contents that we might be interested in. So this first little section says business. So I'm going to click there. And this is going to basically give you kind of a detailed description of the company's operations. And kind of just like, what do they do? How do they make their money? So I'm going to read just, you know, an example so folks get a sense of the language in this and kind of the types of information that you're going to find. So this says, we are a fully integrated real estate investment trust specializing in the ownership, leasing, and management of correctional, detention, and reentry facilities and the provision of community services and youth services in the United States, Australia, South Africa, and the United Kingdom. So right away, that's giving us some interesting information that if we knew nothing about Geo Group, this would be really useful. Like, we know that they're doing a couple different things. They're leasing and managing prisons. They're involved in what they're calling community-based services and youth services. They're doing something with folks who have been in prison who are young people. They're doing re-entry facilities, so, like halfway houses. And they're operating not just in the US, but abroad, so the United States, Australia, South Africa, and the UK. Going on, some other information that might be interesting for us. So as of December 31st, 2016, our worldwide operations include the management and or ownership of approximately 87,000 beds at 104 correctional detention and community-based facilities, including idle facilities and projects under development. And then they also provide community supervision services for more than 174,000 offenders and pretrial defendants. So that's, again, giving us some information about kind of the scope of their business, what they're about. So we really get a sense of what they're doing. The other interesting thing here that I saw as I was reading this over is this part here. We began operating as a REIT for federal income tax purposes, effective January 1st, 2013. And so that might be something that stands out, like they've recently reorganized. And we could do a little Googling and find out that they kind of restructured their corporate structure to be a real estate investment trust, in part to pay less taxes, and they had to kind of restructure their real estate holdings and then their like actual operations. So that's kind of some stuff that's in this business section. Another section that's often useful for folks is this risk factors here, item 1A. So I'm going to click risk factors. And again, a lot of this is boilerplate information that will show up for any corporation, but you basically have the company identifying, here are the things that might potentially endanger our bottom line. Here are the things we want to make sure don't happen because these are risky for our profits. And there's a few things that I wanted to point out to people that I thought were interesting kind of for an organizing context. So one, of course, we have here certain of our business activities may be subject to corporate level income tax and foreign taxes, which would reduce our cash flows and may have potential deferred and contingent tax liabilities. So if one of the things that we're trying to figure out for looking at these kind of corporate filings is what is like the corporate agenda that these companies are forwarding, a key part of that is they don't want to pay taxes. They want to pay the least amount of taxes if they can. And we're seeing that come up in here in a couple of different places. A couple of other useful things down here on page 35. We have this, our growth depends on our ability to secure contracts to develop and manage new correctional detention and community-based facilities and secure contracts to provide electronic monitoring services, community-based reentry, and monitoring and supervision services, the demand for which is outside of our control. So we know from that that it's really important for them that they're winning these contracts with the government. That's like basically where all of their money is coming from. And a couple other things that if we continued reading this, we would see that they've identified as risks. One was public resistance to the use of public-private partnerships for correctional detention and community-based facilities. They really want to make sure that there is like a positive narrative out there about using public and private money together to build prisons and kind of finance their operations. They identify that they might face community opposition to facility location. And then they also identify any negative changes in the level of acceptance or resistance to the use of electronic monitoring products and services by governmental customers could have a material adverse effect on our business, financial conditions, and results of operations. So again, kind of the importance of electronic monitoring and like increased surveillance of folks even after they leave prison was really kind of a theme that was coming up in this filing again and again for me. So you can take a look at that if you're interested more. So I'm gonna go back up to the table of contents. Another thing that's interesting to look at is this property. So they will identify in this first paragraph here, usually first, like where their corporate properties are. And they usually won't put the addresses, but they'll put the different cities. And again, you can kind of Google and do some other creative stuff to identify that. And then they'll also identify where the actual, in this case, like the facilities that they operate and own are. And to find that originally, I just kind of kept scrolling through, but I'm going to use Control F and look up facilities and day reporting centers right here. So you can see this is would be really useful, I think, if you're thinking about like what would a national corporate campaign pressuring Geo Group look like. You have this list of all the different facilities that they operate, who their customer is. So in this case, it's ICE, Los Angeles County. That kind of gives you a good direction for who you would have to pressure if you were trying to get those contracts taken away or kind of intervene in that process. And it keeps going. And I think that would be really useful for folks. The other thing that they also, if you keep going down and looking, they'll identify what they're trying to build in the future, which can be really useful. I'll show that in a sec later. And then the last thing that I wanted to show folks, people can kind of play around after this looking at the table of contents. But the other thing in terms of identifying financing relationships that's really useful is this item 15, exhibits and financial statement schedules. If we click on that, it will identify a bunch of filings that the company has previously put out about their creditors. And so we can start seeing what names of banks and other Wall Street firms are coming up who've been lending money to the Geo Group. So we see here Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, Avondale Partners. And you can get a little bit of a sense that way, and then we'll show you guys at the end. And then you can look up, it identifies here that they have more information about this deal in an 8K filing from May. So you could go back to that page of where you searched all the filings and identify the longer filing if you were interested in reading the whole thing. But that's a quick kind of overview of some of the information you can find in a 10K. And if folks have questions, we'll let you guys know how to ask them and be in contact with us at the end. But that's like a quick, brief intro to the annual report. And I'm going to throw it over to Christiane to talk about another really useful filing, which is the proxy statement.
So, hey folks. So I'm going to spend a few minutes telling you about the DEF 14A, which is the proxy statement, which is a pretty straightforward filing that gives you information about a corporation's address, where shareholder meetings are held, and really useful biographies for executives and key directors of corporations. So if we're looking at Geo Group, Geo Group's proxy statement, you go to the table of contents. And go down to executive biographies. This information is really useful for organizing because it provides information such as the work history, education, and role in the organization for these executives and directors. So if you're looking through the names that are just listed out below, one really interesting detail that I found while I was looking at this proxy statement for Geo Group was that David J. Venturella, who is an executive, actually has a long time career with ICE. He worked over 20 years working with ICE. And so what this reveals to us is that there are deep ties between the criminalization of people of color, working class people, and immigrants, and that this executive is actually bringing his experience in detaining and deporting immigrants into one of the largest prison profiteering corporations in the US. And so, again, this is just an example of the way that executive biographies that are in the proxy statement could be really useful to grassroots organizing. Something else that the DEF 14A provides are executive compensation reports. So if you go down to the summary compensation table, it shows the amount that executives are making over a period of time. So it provides information on the fees that they've earned or paid in cash, stock awards. And this is really useful for us because it's important for us to know exactly how much these individuals are profiting off of the exploitation of the corporation. So it tells us that these individuals do not come from the communities who they are criminalizing, or the majority of Americans who are poor or low income. In fact, these are members of the corporate elite. So whenever we're talking about wealth inequality, this portion of the DEF 14A is really crucial to finding specific numbers that would be useful for talking points and reports when we're organizing. Something else, so the DEF 14A provides this information for both executives and also directors. So you could also go to director biographies and get information about all of the key directors of the organization, which committees they are on. So director committees are really important because it gives us specifics on which directors have the most decision-making power over a specific thing we may be interested in or organizing around.
Sorry, folks, one sec. So you want to go to this election of directors, actually. There we go.
Perfect.
You see nice little pictures of them, and then after that, it'll give biographies, tell you how much stock they own.
Yes, and the stock ownership data is also important.
Show you the committee.
Oh yeah, those are the director committees. So as you can see, it has the Audit and Finance Committee, Corporate Planning Committee, Operations Committee. So when we're identifying targets for our campaigns, this provides, very key information by highlighting the names of the individuals who oversee different areas of the corporation. Yeah, and so then lastly, I'll highlight stock ownership data. So if you go to the table of contents, yep. So stock ownership data is really important because it gives us information about how much investment, right, these directors and executives actually have in terms of shares. And this is important because it allows us to then it allows us to build connections between perhaps what public officials these individuals may be giving to, what legislation they may be lobbying for, and revealing the way that the interests that they are pushing for in our government are not in the public's interest, but in the interests of the corporate elite or this corporation that they actually have their own financial investment in. So stock ownership data is a key portion of the DEF 14A. And now I'll pass it on to Molly to review some information about the 8K.
Cool. Yeah, so I'm going to spend a couple of minutes showing folks a little bit about this filing that's called an 8K, and that's the one that I mentioned before. It's kind of like a press release for the Edgar system. There's like a list of things technically that the Geo Group, when a major thing happens at their company, they have to file this filing in order to let their investors know. And so that can be a bunch of different things. It could be about a new crediting agreement that they have. It could be about like if someone steps down from the board or if there's some kind of major scandal or anything, they often have to file those. Anything that's kind of major happening at the company. And the one that I just looked at kind of the most recent 8K here from May and clicked on it. And this one is actually a transcript of their most recent investor call, which can be really useful and kind of like gold mines of information about companies kind of in real time, what they're thinking about and talking about. And you can often find those like on their website too. Most publicly traded companies will have a little section that says investor relations, and there'll be a little part that talks about transcripts of conference calls, but they're also on the Edgar database. Expected to generate approximately $21 million over the course of the year. And he also goes on to identify a couple other things, kind of projects that have just launched. The other thing that I thought was interesting and is kind of a good thing to look for is they identify kind of opportunities for profit. So, for example, if we go down here to this part where this guy, J. David Donahue, who's a VP there, is talking, he is talking about international markets. And then further down, he starts talking about at the state level. And he says, so moving to the state level, several states continue to face capacity constraints and inmate population growth. And many of our state customers are facing challenges related to aging, inefficient prisons. There are several states, including Oklahoma, Michigan, Kentucky, Kansas, Wisconsin, and others, which have discussed the potential use of public-private partnerships to deal with the overcrowded conditions, as well as to replace older and more costly facilities. And then they go on to talk about those different states, kind of what the opportunities for them that are moving right now are, both on the local level. And so I think, that's something that could be really interesting if we're thinking about how do we organize to kind of stop Geo Group in its track of mass incarceration, identifying what are the local places where they're trying to build new facilities where people could organize to push back on that. And so you can kind of see in real time what's important to them. The other thing that I would just like recommend for folks, particularly in this moment as you're doing this kind of corporate research, is it's always useful to try to do like a control F for Trump or for administration, new administration, to get a sense of what a particular company is saying about that. So for this case, if I did a control F for the word administration, there's two things that come up. Here, the new administration has implemented a number of new policy directives, including ending the previous policy of catch and release and eliminating the many restrictions imposed on ICE officers to carry out the laws that relate to interior immigration enforcement. These changes may lead to increase in apprehensions and detentions in the future. So they're basically talking about how Trump's policies of increased criminalizations of undocumented people are going to provide more business opportunities for them in the future. And I think that's useful, with Geo Group, it's a pretty clear-cut example. Like, it's not surprising that a private prison company would be excited and on board about a lot of the Trump administration. But when we're looking at other companies, there's examples of companies that have, been saying publicly, I live in Philly, like Comcast, for example, has been critiquing Trump a little bit and like letting their employees, walk out in protest of Trump. But at the same time, on their investor calls, they're saying like, we're very excited to work with Trump. We're excited to see what kind of regulations the administration can push. So it's really a good way to get a clear understanding of where particular corporations lie in regards to the Trump agenda. So that's a super quick kind of rundown of some key filings, and we'll have a recording of this just so folks know, in case you didn't get all that. That's totally cool. And then there's also a couple of research guides that we have for folks too. So let me share my screen real quick, and we'll show folks that.
Yeah, so we just went through lots of information about 3 key reports in the SEC Edgar database, and gave you kind of a step-by-step guide on how to navigate these things. There are 2 really useful online research guides that are free and easily accessible for y'all. One is the Corporate Research Guide that was put together by Corporate Research Project, that gives really valuable information about how to explore a company's relationships, analyzing a company's accountability record. It also provides industry-specific research guides. So if you're interested in looking at military contracts or retailing and wholesaling of apparel, steel, telecommunications industry research, they have guides on that, which is super useful. And another guide is the toolkit that we at LittleSis put together that provides a step-by-step guide on how to navigate the 3 reports that we highlighted this evening, in addition to just broadly exploring how to investigate a corporation and also powerful individuals. So we'll send those research guides out to y'all after the call. But as you can see, the URL is up on the screen right now. So I'm sure that folks have a lot of questions. We're going to spend, about 4 to 5 minutes to respond to any questions that you all may have. Feel free to type your questions in the chat, and we'll respond to you that way. All right, any questions? All right, I see we have one that popped up that is, do you use Edgar to research companies that are not publicly held?
Yeah, that's a great question. So some privately held companies will have like a small amount of information on Edgar. It kind of depends. You can do a search in that more general box to figure that out. But in general, you kind of have to do a different research process for private companies. And it's often a lot harder to find a lot of information that we went over tonight. There are kind of creative ways you can get around it, particular databases, which in the future, we can definitely do a training on researching private companies if folks are interested in that. But in general, all of the information that we showed is going to be about public companies only. And there'll be a little bit more limited information about private companies.
Great, and it looks like we have another question, which is, how do we plug into current research or campaign efforts? Which provides a really great segue, actually, into some questions that we have for y'all. So we have some ongoing projects around mapping the corporate funders of Islamophobia, around the police union, and also mapping regional Trump collaborators. So we'll go ahead and start the poll to gauge who's interested in plugging into some of the ongoing research projects that we have happening at LittleSis. Great. So the first poll question is up, which is, do you want to participate in a project to research the corporate backers of the Islamophobia industry? Molly, do you want to share a bit about this research project?
Yeah, so we are partnering with a couple of organizations, including the Action Center on Race and the Economy, and SEIU Local 26 in Minneapolis, which represents a lot of Somali and other Muslim folks in their union, and are interested in organizing around which corporations and billionaires are funding and backing and promoting kind of the Islamophobia industry. And so we've started that a little bit, and we're having kind of activist researchers from around the country take on some Islamophobic organizations like nonprofits, think tanks, foundations, groups that are promoting kind of Islamophobic ideology and looking into who are the key people, what corporations. And so we're definitely using some of the stuff we've just seen, showed y'all in that research. So that's one project that we have going on right now that folks could kind of put some of these skills to use in a way that'll be really useful for organizing happening.
Great. So we have a next poll question, which is, do you want to participate in a project to research the Fraternal Order of Police and their role in racist policing and regressive policy in the United States?
And so this is partnering with some groups that are working on campaigns around racist policing, around some Black Lives Matter stuff, and looking into the police union, doing some power mapping of them. So again, you'll be using some of the skills that we showed tonight as well as some others to put that to use. So if you're interested in joining that team, let us know. And you can be based anywhere, I should say. We're having for both of these projects kind of regular kind of Google Hangout calls and other ways for folks to plug in.
Great. So the last poll question that we have specifically about ongoing research projects is about mapping regional Trump collaborators. So the question is, do you want to participate in a project to power map the key Trump corporate collaborators and other power brokers where you live? Great. So the next poll question is about whether or not you're interested in hosting an in-person LittleSis training. So a part of our Map the Power project is to be able to connect with organizers in different areas throughout the states and to really support the research capacity of some ongoing organizing projects that y'all may be doing in your communities. So if you're interested in hosting an in-person LittleSis training, let us know and we'll get back to you and connect so we can make that happen. And our next question is about whether or not you'd be interested in hosting a LittleSis webinar. So we understand that sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to organize an in-person training, but we are more than happy to also organize a webinar with your organization or community or friends. So on any particular training that you'd be interested in. So I saw someone earlier expressed interest in having a webinar training around public records requests and Freedom of Information Act requests. So that's something that we could also work with y'all one-on-one to organize with a crew of folks in your community. Great. So we will be sending out a survey after this call to gauge more information about what your interests are, what you're organizing around, and ways that we here at LittleSis can collaborate and support your ongoing research and organizing work. So keep an eye out for that survey and please respond so that we can continue to build together. Another thing to keep your eye out for and to mark your calendars for is our next webinar, which is going to be on August 2nd at 8 p.m. That is a Wednesday. And the theme for that webinar will be campaign finance. So get excited. We're really looking forward to being on a call with you. To reach out to us on the Little Sis. Thanks so much for joining us, y'all.
Thanks, everyone. We'll be looking forward to talking with you all soon and seeing you on our next webinar.